First impressions about cruelty are usually valid, and you just can't look at those pictures and not recognize that that's cruelty.
Welcome to the Animal Free Science Advocacy Podcast. My name is Dana, and today I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Lawrence Hansen. Dr. Hansen is a professor of neuropathology at the University of California, San Diego. With a long-standing career in academic medicine, he's published extensively on Alzheimer's disease and brain aging, earning recognition both for his scientific contributions and for his commitment to advancing human-relevant research. Beyond the lab, Dr. Hansen is known for his outspoken criticism of animal experimentation and has even received awards for his advocacy. Today, we'll explore some of the key takeaways from his groundbreaking work, his ethical stance on animal research, and his recommendations on how to advance animal-free science in a world where it is still fiercely supported. Dr. Hansen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, a large focus of your career in neuroscience has been on dementia. We know that neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's and dementia have been among the most studied diseases in history, and yet our treatments for them remain quite limited, with the success rate following preclinical animal studies of less than 1%. We also know that these diseases are caused over a long time by a combination of genetic and environmental factors, making it impossible essentially to accurately mimic in animals. With all of this in mind, why do you think researchers continue to use animals to investigate neurodegenerative diseases?
I think it's a combination of, for a person with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And most of the researchers, their hammer is animal experimentation. So they're going to use that because that's what they were trained to do. There's a couple lines of poetry about, as the twig is bent, so is the tree inclined, and the child is father to the man. So I think when people go through graduate school and go through their postdocs and whatever projects they're working on involve animal experimentation, they're naturally going to think that that tool will apply to everything. And so they apply it to neurodegeneration, where it is most hideously unfitting, because as you say, it's a pretty complicated field, neurodegeneration, and it only happens in humans. There are no natural Alzheimer's disease animals. Old animals don't develop the neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease. I think another reason that people continue to use animal models is historically, back when we had much less sophisticated understanding of pathology, animal models worked. I mean, if you want to go back to 1628, when Harvey tortured horses to find out that blood went from arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins to the heart to back to arteries. Well, that's true in horses, and it certainly is true in humans too, and it's true in almost all the other vertebrates. So that was pretty cool. So back then, animal models, because our understanding of physiology and pathology was so crude, taught us a lot. But then there's been a lot of advances in biochemistry and genetics that show us that millions of years of evolution, when you're starting to look at things at the molecular level, genes and post-translational modifications and proteins and isoforms, that then the similarities become less and less. And you can't really extrapolate from what you do to animals to human animals. Sure, I mean, it turns out that we all use DNA, and they say, well, maybe animal models still work, because even though we're at the molecular level now, it turns out, hey, mice use DNA and the same nucleotides, and they still do transcription and translation and post-translational modification, and they make proteins. But the millions of years of evolution mean that there are lots and lots of not so subtle differences. So it's not like saying a heart in a mouse works like a heart in a human when you're dealing with something as sophisticated as abnormal protein folding in neurodegeneration, which is age dependent and genetically influenced. You can't study that in mice. Unfortunately, they decided, well, as long as the problem is that mice don't have the same genes, we'll put human genes in mice and we will create Frankenstein mice that create human proteins. So they do all this gene modification, and they attempt to put human genes into mice, which will produce the kinds of proteins that accumulate in human neurodegeneration, and then experiment on trying to get the mice to clear the proteins. And they don't seem to appreciate how crude that is, that all the other proteins are mouse proteins. And so, yeah, you can put a human amyloid precursor protein into a mouse, and the mouse will produce amyloid precursor protein, but he won't produce neuritic plaques and he won't produce tangles. And then they can treat the mice and get rid of the Frankenstein-like protein, but then that treatment doesn't work in humans because the pathophysiology is so fundamentally different. So I guess the short answer is, for people, the hammer of every problem looks like a nail. They're trained on mouse models. Mouse models worked back when we were very unsophisticated in terms of anatomy and physiology. And they just got sold on, well, genetic manipulation means we can turn mice into humans. And I think that's naive. We share genetic homology with bananas. We have 60% the same genes, and you're not going to use a banana as an experimental model. So anyway, that's my answer for why they continue to use animal models, even though they've repeatedly been shown to fail to produce any results that can be translated to human patients with neurodegenerative diseases.
And for neurodegenerative diseases, what kind of non-animal research alternatives exist, and how do they fare compared to animal studies?
It's only non-animal research that works in neurodegeneration. I got into this business 40 years ago, and most of your audience is too young to remember, before the neuropathologists studying human brains discovered that most dementia in the elderly was due to what was called Alzheimer's disease. They used to think that old people just got senile normally, and it was due to atherosclerosis and slow cerebral strangulation of blood flow. And it wasn't until the 60s and 70s, when so many people started showing up with dementia because of increasing lifespans, that it was neuropathologists looking at brains from humans who recognized that, hey, these brains are shriveled up and they have these weird plaques in them and these weird tangles in them, and that sounded familiar. So they just went back to old school neuropathology, and they saw the first report was in 1907 by Alzheimer about a 50-something year old lady who became demented, and her brain shriveled up and had plaques and tangles. So it was human neuropathology that revealed that what's actually causing dementia in most of the elderly is not atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, but it's the same pathology that Alzheimer described in a middle-aged female back in 1907. So it started out with brain banks. So they opened up a whole bunch of Alzheimer's disease research centers, and the alternative to the animal model is the perfect animal model, which is the human. So that's how we made a living for a long time, was we looked at brains from people who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and gave approval for their brains to be studied after death. And we compared them to age-matched controls so we could see the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's disease. And then when we took the tissue out and saw these plaques and tangles, we were able to hand off the tissue to the biochemists and the geneticists. And then they were the ones who discovered that, hey, these plaques are made up of this protein called amyloid. And they found out, hey, this amyloid comes from a pre-existing precursor protein called the amyloid precursor protein. And everybody has that. That's normal. And it becomes aberrantly metabolized in the elderly who develop Alzheimer's disease, and a piece breaks off. None of this could have been done without using human brain tissue. And the same thing with the tangles. It turns out that the tangles were made up of tau protein. Everybody has tau proteins. We need tau proteins. But in Alzheimer's disease, after a certain number of years, they become hyperphosphorylated and change their folding conformations and form these peridyllical filaments that are called tangles. All of that came from human neuropathology and passing off human tissue to the chemists. And then the geneticists looked at all the people who were developing Alzheimer's disease, looking for a genetic link, and they're the ones studying humans again. You can't do this with animals because they don't get Alzheimer's. Very rarely, Alzheimer's disease is autosomal dominant, less than 1%. So they looked at the genomes of the 1% of people who have autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease, and that's where they discovered presenilin 1 and presenilin 2, which are on chromosomes far away from where the precursor protein is, but they code for secretases that metabolize the precursor protein. And because of aberrant metabolism, the precursor protein gets turned into the amyloid protein, and these people develop autosomal dominant Alzheimer's. Again, no way you could do that. It's only in humans. And then they found other autosomal dominant families who had a mutation in the Alzheimer's precursor protein itself. And then they realized, if you look at Down syndrome patients, Well, the problem with Down syndrome patients is they have an extra copy of chromosome 21, and guess where the amyloid precursor protein is? It's on chromosome 21. All of the insights about Alzheimer's disease, all of that was based on, I don't even want to say non-animal models because humans are animals, and we're not models. It was Alexander Pope who said the proper study of mankind is man, and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and Huntington's disease can only be studied in humans. And because of these insights, the clever engineers got together and they developed in vivo scanners where you can give somebody an injection and then scan them a little bit later and see how much amyloid is accumulating in their brains. Doesn't hurt them, no side effects. It's just an amyloid scan. So you put a living patient and a control in these scanners, and the brain of the Alzheimer patient lights up because he has amyloid in his brain, and the brain of the age-matched control doesn't light up. And that got even cooler because it turns out that about half the elderly age-matched controls had some amyloid in their brain, but they weren't demented. So then we figured that was a big clue that amyloid might start the process, but it's not causing the dementia. So then they turned their attention to the tau, and they correlate very well with dementia, which the pathologists kind of knew, because when we looked at hundreds of Alzheimer's disease brains, it turns out that the abnormally phosphorylated tau accumulates in a very stereotypic fashion. It always starts in the same part of the brain, progresses and then spreads, and it tracks perfectly with what this neuropsychologists find when they examine people over a 10-year course. Usually Alzheimer's starts at age 70 and you die at age 80, and you go from normal to mild cognitive impairment to mild, moderate, severe dementia. And all of that tracks perfectly with the accumulation of the tau protein. So then they came up with scans where you give somebody a particular tau binding substance, put them in the scanner, and you can scan how much tau protein they have in life. I mean, this is... it seems like science fiction. And then, of course, we decided, well, I bet you we can tell what's going on with these abnormal proteins if we look at the cerebral spinal fluid and we look at the blood. So it turns out you can do a spinal tap in somebody that you think might have Alzheimer's disease, and their cerebral spinal fluid has lower amyloid levels than a normal person does because the amyloids get stuck in the brain, and it has higher tau levels because the neurons are dying and the periodical filaments are leaking out into the cerebral spinal fluid. So you can do biochemical profiling to confirm a clinical diagnosis. And are you kidding me? You think any animal model can touch that, can come close to that? You make some Frankenstein mouse and you think you can track the evolution of the disease, the progression of the dementia, the correlations of the lesions with the cognitive impairment? Ludicrous.
Yeah.
And now they've come up with a blood test where they can look at amyloid levels and tau levels in the blood. So they don't even have to do a spinal tap, which has inspired all sorts of therapeutic efforts to dissolve the amyloid in the people who have amyloid but aren't demented yet, or come up with some way to untangle the tau. It's a long answer, but what I'm trying to say is there are no animal alternatives to studying human brains and living humans without hurting them. The perfect animal model for neurodegeneration in humans is humans.
And I guess it's really hard to hear all that and know that some of the most horrific animal experiments that continue today are neuroscience experiments, and we see a lot of these conducted on primates, for example, with these horrible plates injected into placed into their skulls, and brain injuries inflicted onto them, and all sorts of horrific things. And yet we hear all of these incredible stories about how we're advancing human health with this amazing technology like imaging and our pathology capabilities, and we're just not using them to the capacity that we can. We're still placing so much of our reliance on these pretty archaic animal models, or at least they look that way.
Oh, they are. It's hideous. One of my pet projects has been railing against primate vivisectors, horrific primate experiments going on at the University of California, San Francisco, where they're attempting to further refine our knowledge about the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is what allows us to smoothly track moving objects with our eyes. And those are the ones that are it's just hard to look at them because the monkeys have to have holes drilled in their skulls and electrodes placed in their brain, and they have to have electrodes and other apparatus drilled into their semicircular canals. And then they have to have their heads bolted to a frame, and they have to be dragged to they have to be dragged to a chair and bolted in the chair. And then they have to track moving objects. And because they don't want to do that after having been tortured, they have to have dehydration. So they're deprived of liquids until they're so dehydrated that they will track the object for a sip of water. I mean, it's just hideous.
It's
and
shocking.
When I read these grants, the vestibulo-ocular reflex is cool. It's nice to know more about how we can visually track moving objects. It does advance our scientific knowledge of basic neurophysiology. I don't dispute that. What infuriates me is when you read the grants after describing this hellacious protocol, they will always toss in, and this knowledge may someday allow us to learn more about how to cure neurodegenerative diseases of the visual. Well, they say neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. They pick the one system that's never affected in Alzheimer's disease is the vestibulo-ocular reflex, but they always put in this teaser that the funding agencies should pay for this because someday it will cure Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's totally disingenuous, but it's a bait and switch.
Right. We're nearly 100 years into this kind of research, and the numbers and figures are still the same. We're still waiting for these big breakthroughs that they speak of.
This episode is made possible by Animal-Free Science Advocacy supporters. If you would like to help support the podcast, go to animalfreescienceadvocacy.org.au.
When it comes to animal research, you say that there are two categories of people. A, those who think it advances science and cannot be convinced otherwise. And B, those who are uncomfortable about it, but ultimately support animal research because the ends justify the means. And these people can be convinced otherwise. So what is the difference between these two types of people, and why are some willing to listen, whereas others are steadfast in their views no matter what?
I think the difference is between the basic science people in category one. And for them, increasing knowledge is the be-all and end-all. So that means that even though their science doesn't translate to increased human benefit, that doesn't really matter to them because all they want to do is increase knowledge. So I have to grant that these hideous experiments about the vestibulo-ocular reflex increases our knowledge about the vestibulo-ocular reflex. But to me, and to a lot of other animal people, when you see how horribly the animals are treated, how horrific and hellacious these experiments are, we would say, well, that's just too much cruelty. I could live with a little less knowledge about the pathophysiology of the vestibulo-ocular reflex if it would spare the monkeys this kind of torture. And the basic scientists people would say, well, we don't really care about the monkeys. All we care about is the knowledge. The knowledge is the be all and end all. And there's basically science is their God, and gods demand animal sacrifices. So for them, there's no cost-benefit analysis to make because it's all benefit. And because they don't care about the suffering of the animals, there's no cost. They're not even all that nobly motivated to just increase knowledge, even though the knowledge has no applicability to improving human health. Their careers are based on publications and grants, and that's how they get promoted. So they want to do experiments that give them results that they can publish. And that matters to them, whereas whether the results translate into human benefit really doesn't. And because they're basically psychopaths when it comes to animal suffering, they don't really see any conflict. They don't see any ambiguity. The people in the second category are the ones who claim that their research will eventually result in improved human health care. And they're the kind of people who are a little more queasy about hurting animals. They have a little more natural empathy for animals. But of course, they always put their own interests above the interests of other animals. And they think, well, if we torture these animals, but it's going to cure my mom's cancer, go ahead and torture them. But they don't want animals tortured. They want cures. So in that second category of people, they do an ethical cost-benefit analysis. And they will say, well, if the benefit is going to be cure cancer, then okay, the ethical cost, which bothers me, I'm willing to pay or make the animals pay. But these people can be approached because you can show them with multiple meta-analyses of animal research. Like you said, in neurodegeneration, less than 1% lead to any treatment for Alzheimer's disease. But that's not just neurodegeneration, that's animal research in general. I've published reviews of multiple meta-analyses showing how poorly the basic science that's done in animal research ever translates into improved human healthcare. And even when they try to translate, how often the treatments don't work or they just make patients worse. So if you can present that to the people who want to do a cost-benefit analysis, and you say, well, wait a minute, the benefit is not what they're selling. The benefit is 0 or 1 or 2%, and the ethical cost is really, really high. And research funding is a zero-sum game. It's clear, I think, from the data that human-based research, clinical trials, microdosing, all sorts of methods based on human materials are much more likely to lead to the cure for your grandma's cancer or your grandfather's Parkinson's disease. Human-based studies are much more likely to result in treatments. And so since it's a zero-sum game, any money that goes to vestibulo-oculo monkey torture is not going to human-based research, which is much more likely to pay off. So I think if you present the argument like that, say, well, the animal research doesn't, in fact, usually lead to human healthcare improvement, and it has a very high ethical cost, and it takes money away from things that will work, you can appeal both to the better angels of their nature who don't want animals to suffer, and our natural human selfishness, and say, well, it's just not efficacious, and if you want these cures, you better spend the money some other way. So they're not like the people in group A who think science is the be all and end all, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it helps humans. All that matters is that it increases knowledge and gets me publications. The other people, the ones who are queasy about it, they want you to prove that it's going to help humans if they're going to pay this cost of horrible animal suffering.
I think what I find most confusing about people in group A is that, so you say knowledge is the be all and the end all, but this knowledge is intended at the end of the day to help us. It's intended to advance human health. So why would they not care about its relevance to human health?
I don't think it's intended to do that. It's like, I don't want to sound like I'm praising people in group number one, but you could say in like physics, when you're talking about quarks and gluons and stuff, they're advancing knowledge, looking for the Higgs boson. None of that is going to improve human healthcare or improve humans. It's cool stuff. And we want to know a theory of everything. So people who are really into science, who worship science as their God, would say, well, it doesn't matter whether it has any impact on human lives or not. Our goal is just to increase knowledge. And they think that that's true in pathology and physiology and molecular biology and biochemistry. So if they can increase knowledge, that's it. That's the be all and end all, not applicability to improving the human condition.
Okay. I guess it can be quite confronting or even hurtful to engage with people in category A. How would you deal with someone like this? And is there a way that you can have meaningful conversation with them?
Yeah, boy, that's really hard. I think it's a hard lesson, and almost all the deep, big lessons in life are hard lessons, and they're counterintuitive, and we resist them. But I think the hard, deep lesson about this is morality and ethics are entirely subjective. So bear with me with a couple of quotes from people who are smarter than I am who've thought about this. When Bertrand Russell said that I cannot see how to refute the argument for the subjectivity of all ethical values, but I refuse to accept that the only thing wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. And then my personal hero, Abraham Lincoln, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he cut to the chase and he said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. But Lincoln, being as deep and brilliant as he was, it's interesting that really lays out the issue. But he leaves the possibility, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. And philosophically, That's a possibility. That's a possible position, is that there is no right and wrong, that everything is just a matter, like Bertrand Russell says, of subjective values. And you can't prove, Wittgenstein said, there's not a fact in the world that proves that murder is wrong. Marcus Aurelius and Hamlet both say there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. I'm almost done with the quotes, but I've thought about this for a long time, so bear with me. And Thucydides, who was an ancient Greek, 400 BC, he cut to the chase about the essence of morality. He said, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And that's the ethics of people in the basic science group. They're strong and they'll do what they can, and the animals will suffer what they must. And the problem is that we all intuitively believe that there are moral facts. And if we would just present the moral facts to the people who think differently, they will agree with us. But there are no moral facts, although it seems so intuitive that cruelty is wrong and slavery is wrong. But that's just our opinion. And that's the big, deep lesson. It's hard to take in that people could think that cruelty is okay in some circumstances. And for a long time in human history, everybody thought slavery was okay. And for a long time in human history, everybody thought women as chattel was okay. It's just the way it was. In fact, it's from the etymology of the word moral. It comes from a Latin word mores, which means customs. So our morals and our ethics are just customs. And if you can, as counterintuitive and as painful as that is, if you can grasp that when you're talking to people who endorse animal research, or even factory farming. I mean, even meat eaters, their morality is different than ours. And that's what makes the conversation so difficult. Nobody likes to have their morality questioned. And people that have questioned other people's morality, like Lincoln, questioned the morality of slavery, and Gandhi questioned the morality of the British colonials, and Martin Luther King questioned the morality of Jim Crow laws and civil rights. They all got killed. People don't like it when you question their morality. But you have to understand that these people think that they are being as moral as you are, but their morality is different. I mean, I'm with Bertrand Russell. I understand this intellectually, that morality is subjective. But I refuse to accept that the only thing wrong with animal cruelty is that I don't like it.
Right. Well, I guess in the same way that people are uncomfortable about having their morality questioned, a lot of people would also not want to hear about the realities of animal testing because it is uncomfortable, it is unpleasant. And I guess it is really similar to people who don't want to hear about the way that animals are slaughtered, but will continue to eat meat. So how do we deal with cognitive dissonance like this?
Yeah, I used to wonder when I go to the grocery store and you walk past the meat counter and you see these big slabs of animal flesh, which to people like us is kind of revolting. You wonder if they had a big panorama behind it of the slaughterhouse, how that would affect people's meat purchases. And of course, they're not going to have the panorama of the slaughterhouse, and the horrors of animal vivisection have only been revealed by people who go undercover and film these poor monkeys with their bolted brains. And anyway, yeah, how do you force people to confront that? How do we tackle this cognitive dissonance? Boy, that's really tough. Like I say, having been in academics for my whole career, turns out my best friends include vivisectors, just like vegans have to recognize that most of their friends are going to be carnivores. And again, we keep coming back to this irrational emotional belief that there are moral facts, and if we just push the moral facts in front of their faces and shake them by the shoulders, they will recognize and agree with us. But they won't, because they have different morality.
Well, some recent studies in Australia have raised serious ethical concerns, such as the use of methods of strangulation and traumatic brain injury in animals. Now, outside of the laboratory, this would be considered a crime punishable by law. So how is it that even with animal ethics committees and what the university would call a rigorous evaluation process, this kind of treatment of animals is allowed? Why is the lab exempt from the same laws as everyone else?
Well, that's back to the wolves guarding sheep. It's allowed because the system is rigged to allow it. All of the supposed safeguards, you talk about rigorous, rigorous review. Again, I have to keep coming back to, I'm pretty familiar with it with the system in America, and I'm sure Australia has the same kind of thing. All of the safeguards for animals in research were forced upon the vivisection animal research industrial complex by an outraged public. In America, it started with people who would go undercover and work as animal laboratory technicians, but really they were filming what was going on. And then when the movies about the monkeys in the Silver Springs, Maryland came out, people were horrified that their tax dollars were going to what was just obviously torture. The scientists would say, oh, no, it's not torture. But the funny thing is that the first impressions about cruelty are usually valid. And you just can't look at those pictures and not recognize that that's cruelty. But the vivisectors don't look at it that way. This is a bit of a digression, but I had a kind of a heated confrontation with one of the vivisectors at UCSD. He was also involved in Alzheimer research. He was trying to do implants of stem cells into Alzheimer disease brains. But before that, he had to do implants of stem cells into monkey brains. And I referred to his experiments as monkey torture and murder. And he came to my office kind of in a rage. And he said, how can you say that? We use the same neurosurgical techniques on these monkeys that we use on human beings. And I said, well, yeah, but we use them on human beings to make sick people better. You use them on monkeys to make normal monkeys sick. I mean, despite the fact you're using modern neurosurgery, you're doing it to harm the monkeys. You're not doing it to help the monkeys. But they justify it in their own minds.
But what did he say to that?
Well, he stormed out of the office. That was kind of the end of the discussion. But any constraints that have been put on animal researchers like him came from outraged public. So the public was horrified, and they talked to their representatives, and the representatives back in the 70s, they responded to public pressure, and they mandated these institutional animal use and care committees that said, okay, before you do this stuff to monkeys or any other animal for that matter, it has to go through a committee of people who will analyze what you're proposing to do and the reason you're proposing to do it, and we'll do an ethical cost-benefit analysis. In other words, they're going to say, okay, if you're going to do something really horrible to these animals, there better be a really great benefit to justify it. And so a whole bureaucracy was set up about all animal protocols have to go through what in America is called an institutional animal care and use committee. And that was a noble effort. It was a really good try. But to get back to your question, why are these horrible things allowed despite these committees that are supposed to be looking out for the animals? The universities managed to game the system very quickly. They realized that there was no stipulations beyond 3 members. There had to be a veterinarian, there had to be a community member, and there had to be an animal researcher on the committee. But there was no limit to how many other people you could put on the committee. So then they loaded the committee with animal researchers. And so it became a rubber stamp. And I looked into IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, approval rates at UCSD, and it was 98%. So 98% of anything anybody proposes to do to animals gets through the IACUC. And the researchers will say, well, this is just evidence of how careful we are. I mean, obviously, we're doing a great job if 98% is considered to be okay. But what they don't say is, yeah, but that's because the people who say it's okay are doing the same thing. And it goes even deeper than that, of course, because this is all federal funded. So when somebody has a research protocol that's supposed to get funded by the feds, it goes to the National Institutes of Health, where the grant is reviewed, and they constitute the review committees with people who do the same thing. So you have a bunch of primate vivisectors on the review committee looking at protocols for primate vivisection, and they naturally enough say, oh, this looks pretty reasonable to us. So they game the system so that they can claim that they are following careful protocols for the protection of animals. But 98% of anything they want to do is approved. That's no protection at all. So that's why animals can end up being subjected to these horrible things is because it's just ethical inbreeding. It's a rubber stamp, and they manage to do an end around when the public is outraged. It just, and every once in a while, some brave undercover person will take a job in an animal research facility and will film burning beagles or some other horrible thing, and it'll get published and it'll create a stink. And every once in a while, they will sort of revisit the regulations for the IACUCs, and they'll try to tighten them, and the university will go around them because, of course, the university likes to flatter itself that it's not a business, but it's a business and it wants money, so it wants grants. So if you get grant money, it turns out 50% of that goes to university overhead. So the more grants that come in, the richer the university is. So they want scientists submitting grants, and the scientists want to do their experiments because they get publications and they get promotions. And it's a kind of an incestuous relationship among the funding agencies. It's like a positive
reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a reinforcing loop. And that's why things that are just, well, obviously cruel beyond the pale get approved routinely.
Yes, it's quite shocking. And it goes back to what you said earlier as wolves entrusted with guarding sheep, whereby the research industry is essentially run by people who profit from their use in this way, which is an obvious conflict of interest. So what needs to happen for animals to be granted proper protections? And is it even possible to protect them when we are knowingly putting them at risk and intentionally inflicting harm upon them?
Yeah. Well, that comes back to Lincoln and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who, again, were all assassinated. The problem, well, it's a very deep problem. So the first group we talked about are people that don't care about animals. They're animal psychopaths. And the second group, they draw a wider circle of compassion. I mean, when you talk about where do you draw your circle of compassion, a psychopath just draws it around himself. And that's why he is incapable of empathy, and he can manipulate other people because the only person who matters is him. That's a true psychopath. Most people aren't that bad, and they draw their circles around their nuclear family, or they draw them around their extended relatives, or maybe their clan, or some people draw it around their ethnic group. More and more people included in your circle of compassion. And then some of us draw a big enough, broad enough circle that it includes animals. And those are the ones who want to end animal research, or at least do this ethical cost benefit analysis. So how do you get more people to draw their circle of compassion widely enough to include the animals? Well, you're not going to convince the hardcore scientists who are basically animal psychopaths, and you're going to have a hard time convincing the universities because, again, they get the grants and the funding and all that stuff. And you can't convince people with moral reasoning or ethical reasoning because ethics is ultimately subjective. So you have to substitute legality for morality. And you can't persuade somebody to stop doing what you consider to be immoral if they don't consider it to be immoral. But you can pass a law to stop them from doing it. And Lincoln was very careful about bringing the country along towards abolishing slavery, and he was trying to move public opinion along slowly and slowly and slowly. And finally, he had to pass the Emancipation Proclamation, and there had to be a war to end slavery. I mean, what could be more obviously wrong? But that's what it took. Gandhi had to do a lot of those peaceful protests and get the shit beat out of them. And Martin Luther King, they had to do their civil rights marches, and they got beaten up too by the cops. They all got killed at the end. But I don't think we have to be that drastic. But I do think it's going to require substituting legality for morality. You're going to have to. This is such a lame answer, and I really wish there was a more efficacious way to approach it. But it has to be laws. We have to elect people whose morality is similar to ours, and then pass laws that will impose. Yeah, it will impose our morality. The cruelty is wrong on people who don't have that morality, and they will simply have to stop doing it because it is not legal, rather than try to persuade them with moral reasoning.
Right. Now, coming back to you, have you faced challenges in your education and your career due to your stance on animal research?
Yeah, I've been hassled by it. I had I'm kind of ashamed to admit that I backed down the first time because I didn't have tenure yet. But I used to teach a neuroanatomy course, when I was a young professor. And I knew that we were using serial sections of monkey brains. So I'd been over to the Salk Institute, and I discovered that they had a vast underground prison system where they kept their monkeys, where they did their vivisection. And I was kind of horrified by that. And so during one of my lectures, I referred to the Salk Institute as the Josef Mengele Institute of Neuroscience Research. And that didn't go over too well with the head of that institute. So he came to my office and he said, you must stop saying anything that compares primate vivisectors to Nazis. And I said, but I think they are like Nazis. I mean, Nazis experimented on unwilling primates, and you guys over there experiment on unwilling primates. I think you are acting like Josef Mengele. And he said, if you don't stop saying things like that, I will have a Jewish student go to the dean and accuse you of anti-Semitism because you're comparing Jews to primates. And I said, well, that is a low thing to do. That is a terrible, rotten thing to do. But you got me. I don't have tenure and I don't want to get in trouble with the dean. So, okay. So I backed down from that. And then later I was involved in anti-dog labs. So they were still vivisecting dogs and then killing them to teach pharmacy and physiology in the medical school. And I knew that I did that when I was a medical student too. And I'm kind of ashamed to admit that I vivisected a dog because they told me to do it in pharmacy, to realize that, oh, gee, everything they said about these drugs, it's true. You give this drug, the heart speeds up. You give that drug, the heart slows down. But everybody knew that. We weren't learning anything new. Why did we have to kill these dogs? And so years later, some students at UCSD came and said, they're still killing dogs that teach pharmacology and physiology. And so I joined a movement to end the dog labs so that they wouldn't kill dogs anymore, because after 40 years in my career, I've never come across a problem where I thought, I could figure this out if I just killed more dogs. I recognized how ludicrous that was, how unnecessary that was, how gratuitous that was. And so I got a bunch of doctors to sign an anti-dog lab petition. So all these doctors, got like 300 of them to sign a petition that said, want UCSD to stop their dog labs because we're doctors and we know what it takes to be a doctor. And they were sort of telling the students, well, unless you're willing to cut up these dogs and kill them, you don't have what it takes to be a doctor. And so we had an organization called Doctors Against Dog Labs. So that inspired the pharmacy and physiology chairs to contact my department chair and tell me to stop because I was interfering with their academic freedom. So I got a call from him and he said, are you interfering with their academic freedom? And I said, well, I'm trying to do the best I can. If their academic freedom equals killing dogs, you bet I'm trying to interfere with it. So he said, well, it's going to cause trouble. So they formed 2 ad hoc committees to investigate my interference with the academic freedom of the physiology and pharmacology course. And that was kind of nasty and ugly, and it went on and on. So I was warned to stop doing this kind of stuff. And then other times I made offhand remarks during lectures about how unnecessary vivisection was and how unnecessary dog killing was. And it got some students who liked killing dogs to go complain to the dean about it. So I had some called on the carpet moments. That kind of stuff has happened through my career. Yeah.
Yeah. And having gone through those experiences, what advice would you give to others facing similar situations in their workplace or their educational institution?
Boy, it would sure help if you have tenure, which actually I got much more active once I got tenure. I wouldn't have backed down from the first guy if I'd had tenure at the time. Well, I mean, I'm in no position to tell other people to be brave, but that's about all I can tell you.
So one of the common arguments that proponents of animal research use in its favor is that animals are like us being people. But when asked about the ethics and the pain and the trauma, etc., they'll say, well, animals are different from humans, and so it's ethically permissible to use them. It's a convenient contradiction that we see being used over and over and over again. How has this defense prevailed for so long, and what do you say to counter this?
Yeah, well, again, it's people who have different ethics than we do, different morals than we do. And I would counter it by saying, well, one of the reasons we should never vivisect primates is because they are so much like us. You're getting very close to the slippery slope where, well, why not do it on prisoners, incarcerated humans? Primates are genetically so similar to us in an ethical and moral sense, and in their cognitive ability to suffer social deprivation and isolation. Like John Stuart Mill said, or maybe it was Jeremy Bentham who said, the question isn't can they think, but can they suffer? And it's just so obvious that any neuropsychological studies on primates show how sophisticated their thinking is and their capacities for suffering from simply being caged. They're so much like us. So don't experiment on primates because they're so much like us. And don't experiment on dogs and cats, I would say, because after 10,000 years of selective breeding, the poor beasts have no choice but to love us. I mean, we have selectively bred dogs to love us, no matter how mean we are to them. We've taken away all their instinct for self-preservation, 10,000 years only breeding the friendly ones. We've hardwired them to love us. And to me, that's a huge ethical betrayal to create an animal built to love us because we like being loved, and then use it as an experimental animal and cage it and torture it after having created an animal built to love us. A lot of people don't believe that about cats, but I've had enough cats. I know cats love us too. So I guess my attempting clever phrasing is we don't vivisect primates because they are so much like us, and we don't vivisect dogs and cats because they like us so much. That's my usual response to people who use that fallacious argument about they're similar enough to us that we can get useful information, but dissimilar enough that we don't have any ethical responsibility to them. Again, my ethics just differ from theirs.
Sure. And for everyday people, how can they be a part of this movement for change in animal research? What role can they play in pushing for change in this space?
Okay, well, again, number one is become a single issue voter. Just whenever there's an election, whether it's local or national, in the United States, the Humane Society puts out a scorecard on how legislators have voted on animal issues. And I just vote just along the line of whichever candidate has been better on animal welfare issues, whichever one voted against caging chickens, whichever one voted in favor of free range versus caging, whichever one voted for, all those things. And so you get a scorecard and you make sure to vote for the one who has animal welfare high on their agenda. And the other thing that actually worked out pretty well with the dog labs, which I hadn't thought of, is one of my collaborators. He filed a Freedom of Information Act. That's a law we have in the United States where anybody who gets public funding has to disclose a lot about how they're spending it. And it's a lawyerly thing to do. And it turned out it tied the university administration up in knots because they had to release all the emails about the controversy of the dog labs that went between the physiology department and the pharmacology department and the dean and me. And it just cost them so much time and trouble that eventually the administrators said to the physiology and pharmacology people, look, let's just drop this, shall we? It's just more trouble than it's worth. But then the even cleverer way to do it was somebody started a campaign, because UCSD is a major mover and shaker in San Diego, an online campaign about don't donate any money to UCSD until they end the dog labs. And so there was kind of a grassroots effort to flood the dean's office with all these promises that I used to donate to UCSD, but I will not donate a dime to you guys until you end those unnecessary dog labs. So if you can hit them in the wallet, if you're normally a donor to a university or a college, just let them know. Say, I'm not giving you any money until you end vivisection, and I can spend my money better elsewhere. So those kind of things seem to work pretty well with the dog labs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. That's all we have time for today. We love how you've broken down these complex and multifaceted arguments into really simple concepts. And these conversations are going to be so much easier now with some of the insights you've given us. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It warms my heart to know that there are fellow travelers out there who have ethics similar to mine, which whether it's ultimately subjective or not, I think we have the right ethics, and people that are cruel to animals have the wrong ethics.
We would agree. And for anyone who needs more information, please don't hesitate to visit the AFSA website. That's www.animalfreesci.org.au. Thank you so much for listening.